For every movie, game, and album you love, there are legions of people behind the scenes making sure it sounds magical.
Almost every recording studio in the Bay Area was recording something for Apocalypse Now.
That's where legendary 7-time Grammy-winning recording engineer Leslie Ann Jones got her professional start. You've heard her work with everyone from Herbie Hancock to Carlos Santana, been transported into worlds like Halo, Forza, and Civilization, and even seen kids light up to the Grammy-winning music of Happy Feet.
I like to think that I just, in the end, spread a little fairy dust on it.
What would you do if an artist told you to make the music sound more blue or more round? Leslie Ann Jones has an answer. I'm Vonn Vanier, and this is Beyond the Notes. Leslie, welcome to the show. So you come from an exceptionally talented family. Both your parents are musicians. Who went on to be very famous, and your brother as well as a Emmy-winning producer. And what was life like for you in your childhood, and if you have any particular anecdotes or stories that you remember that really illustrate what it was like back then?
My father was the musical satirist Spike Jones, and my mother was a wonderful singer, and her name was Helen Greco, and they were married. I grew up spending a lot of time watching their performances. When they would perform in Las Vegas, for instance, they would perform for a couple of weeks at a time. You would think of that now as a residency at one of the big hotels or something, but sort of everybody did that. They didn't perform just once or for a couple of days. It was like 3 weeks at a time. And, when you're a kid in Las Vegas then, in the 50s and early 60s, there's not much to do at night other than go watch your parents. So I was exposed to some of the best musicians at a very early age. And we also got to see a lot of other people perform as well. So, that was a really interesting way to grow up. Yeah.
So you're largely self-taught. You went from being a musician and actively playing the instruments and shifted more towards the world of sound engineering, which you do have continued to do today. So I'm curious to know, what was the very first engineering trick that you kind of discovered yourself that made you feel, sort of like a sonic wizard, and what was the story behind how you came to discover it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have ever felt like a sonic wizard. I think, I think probably editing, as in analog cutting tape editing.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to put together a really good take of something just by editing a bunch of takes together.
Yeah.
Was, a pretty powerful thing. I remember when I was at the Automat, which is a studio. It was a studio here in the Bay Area that no longer exists. I was recording a kind of a Dixieland big band from the Sacramento area, and they blew the ending of a take, and so they were going to do the whole take again. And I said, well, no, why don't we just, back up 16 measures and just start playing and play to the end and do the end right, and I'll edit it together. That concept was completely foreign to them. And so we recorded the ending, and it was perfect, and I cut the two together, and they came in and heard it, and they were just astounded. So I suppose that, of anything, made me feel like a sonic wizard.
So IMDb lists you as an uncredited sound recordist on Apocalypse Now. So how did you land that land that gig, and did any of the on-set chaos carry over into the music sessions? And what about that moment or experience do you still remember and still sticks with you today?
Well, it's funny you say uncredited sound recorders because I never did sound on the set, but I was, uh, again, the Automat Recording Studios was owned by David Rubinson, who produced and managed Herbie Hancock and the Pointer Sisters and was an extremely well-known record producer. And Francis Coppola had hired David to produce the music for the movie. And because I was working at the Automat, that's how I ended up working on the soundtrack. And but I would say that almost every recording studio in the Bay Area was recording something for
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now. Mickey Hart from the Grateful Dead was doing it at their studio. Patrick Gleason, who was doing it at Different Fur, and we were recording a lot of stuff at the Automat, and then we ended up mixing the music there for the soundtrack
Yeah.
as well. Um, so that's how I got into it. But it's looks great on my credit list that the first movie I worked on was Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really incredible, and what's especially inspiring to me is your breadth. As you mentioned, you do all these different genres, and everything from R&B and doing the next day classical and whatnot. And you've worked on so many different projects with so many different artists, from Rosemary Clooney to Herbie Hancock, and different films and the Happy Feet soundtracks, and even video game scores, among so many others. So, do you think your approach or emotional and technical challenges of each different type of project, are they all the same, or are they different?
Every project has its own unique challenges, and
Mhm.
doing recording music for a record is certainly different than recording music for a film score. And that's not the same as recording music for a video game. They all have their unique technical requirements, certainly different personalities. Um, but having said that, it's all um, no matter what it is, it's all around storytelling. And I think that the biggest difference is that, of course, if you're doing a record for if you're recording music just for a record where there's no visual component, then you really have to work much harder, I think, at trying to tell what that story is from the lyrics or from the composition in terms of dynamics and um, performance. I'm um, working on an opera right now, and originally it wasn't going to be a film, it was just going to be a recording. And I remember working with the singers on really trying to, be more emotive with their singing, because nobody was going to see them on stage doing hand gestures and
Yeah.
walking around and all of that. So
Mhm.
the listener really needs to get that from what they convey with the emotion in their voice. Yeah, when you have visual media, of course, particularly in film scores, you're following something that's already on the screen,
Yeah.
and who knows what kind of sound effects are going to be added to it, and
Mhm.
uh, all of that. So that that's different as well. Whereas video games might have the same size orchestra, but
Mhm.
it's not a linear format. It's really cut into different scenes.
Yeah.
And, so that's completely different than, film scores.
Mhm. Was there ever a time when there was a wild piece of gear failure, like mid-session, and you had to sort of MacGyver it back on the fly?
It's not that that's unusual because, things don't fail all the time. But, I think particularly because I started so many years ago when things were not as kind of compact as they are now, in terms of, you know, if something's going to go wrong, your computer's just going to shut down and you can't start it back up again and you're hosed, you know?
Yeah.
When I started, we had, multiple tape machines and a console that was, modular. So if an EQ went out, then you could just patch into another EQ. And, I mean, it was much easier to sort of fix things than and be able to carry on. But I've had sessions where we've had a power failure where the transformer was hit by a car and we weren't going to get power back for a couple of days, and we had to punt and go to another recording studio and you know set set back up and that stuff like that. But fortunately, that's only happened once. So
Yeah. Would you say that was the wildest piece of gear failure you've ever had, or have you had?
well, it was more than gear failure. It was like nothing worked. And it was there was a guest artist that was playing with the group that had flown in
Mhm,
and had a limited amount of time, so it's not like we could just wait the 3 days to get power back on and
mhm.
reschedule. So it was um, pretty amazing that we were able to recover.
So early on in your career, someone told you, you're going to have to spend a lot of time with people. So you're going to need to learn how to get along with them. And so I'm curious to know how you've navigated that skill throughout your career and how you interpret kind of metaphorical, strange feedback from musicians at times, like make it more blue, when there are, lots of pressure on the line and hundreds of people relying on you to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, that actually has happened that, somebody, used a color to describe what they wanted. And, um, um, although I'm not sure where the quote came from about somebody having, told me that necessarily, although it is true, you do spend a lot of hours with the same group of people. And, um, if you're not a good people person, this is not a good job for you because you really have to be able to perhaps deal with a lot of competing opinions about what things should sound like. Um, People that might not have like you say, they want it more blue. I mean, that's their only way of describing what it is they want. They don't have the the language that they need that would be helpful. Um, so you just have to, I don't know, kind of um, eventually figure out sort of by perhaps asking more questions about what it is they want until you can figure out what they're getting at,
Mhm,
and then try different things until you hit on something that they um, like. But it is definitely a people person job. It's a lot of it is diplomacy,
mhm,
like when I'm just engineering, I don't get on the talk back and tell the artist what to do.
mhm,
When I was an assistant, I was just an assistant. If I had a suggestion, I made it to the engineer, and I did go to the producer because that would have circumvented the engineer's job. There's certainly a hierarchy in the studio that you have to not honor, but just respect. Um, at the same time, I always, from the time I first started, I always thought about things not from just where I was sitting, but uh, the next stage up. So when I was an assistant engineer, I thought a lot about, I try to think a lot like the engineer.
Mhm.
So to try and anticipate what the engineer might need in terms of, a different microphone or something like that, or paying attention to what the artists were saying. Maybe their headphones weren't sounding right, or something like that. And when I was an engineer, then I started thinking like the producer, especially in the age of analog,
Mhm.
where you would know, you'd sort of have to recognize places where you could start and stop, and places where you might have to edit. And so if you waited until you were done and then you started searching for stuff, then you've waited too long. So I would start, I would really try and think like the person whose job was next. And that allowed the recording sessions to move a lot faster, and for me to be able to anticipate what people uh, wanted.
Is there any advice you've had or anything that every composer should know before walking into the studio that makes your job easier and that you think makes for like a better final recording result?
Well, I think, preparation's the most important thing. Certainly here,
Mhm.
we spend a lot of time doing pre-production, so we talk to the composer or the producer to get as much information as possible, what the orchestra setup is, if there's anything.
Yeah.
I might ask a composer, for instance, what kind of sound are they looking for? Particularly, with video game scores. Is it a big brassy sound? Is there a lot of emotion to the music? You know, um, I think it's just important to, you know, have all the instrument parts right. But I would say probably one of the most important things is to have a good conductor, and not all composers are good conductors. And I think that it's important to perhaps recognize that and be able to step back and be able to listen to the orchestra and watch a conductor and be able to communicate with that person on the things that perhaps you might not be getting from your composition, or that you want a little more out of. And, there are good conductors and there are bad conductors. There are conductors that just wave their hands, and, which is kind of funny when there's a click already and it doesn't really
Mhm.
matter. But, and there are composers that really get the best out of the orchestra in terms of, being able to interpret what the composer wants. And so, yeah, I think that that's the most important thing. And if you are going to conduct yourself, make sure you have somebody in the booth that also understands what it is you're going for, to make sure that you get all the takes that you need, that things are played well, that intonation's good, and the more you can do with that, the better product you'll have. Um,
Yeah. Absolutely. That's terrific advice. I'll keep it in mind from now on. And so at your annual 10-day audio camps for women at IMA, you teach mics, mixing consoles, and workflow. Have you ever gotten a question from a student or an idea from a student that made you rethink some aspect of what you do?
hmm, I don't recall anything in particular.
Mhm.
Um, it's always, and I don't teach. IMA stands for Institute for the Musical Arts. It's a girls' performance camp in Goshen, Massachusetts, and they have several uh, tracks of camp during the summer. One is a recording camp,
Mhm.
and uh, and it's mostly around, teaching girls and young women how to record themselves. And there were only, in all the years that I did it, there were really only a couple of young women that had decided to pursue an engineering career. It was really more about performing and being able to understand the technology and all of that. And it was always interesting to me seeing their eyes and ears open when we would have singers on different microphones and they could hear the difference in those microphones, or trying different microphones on um, piano, for instance. And then when we would go to do the recording sessions, they they uh, were appreciating enough about what they heard in terms of sonically what they heard, that they would say, "Oh, why don't we use those mics?" And watching them, kind of grow over the days, and build up confidence and all that.
You've talked about in the past how you saw classes of sound engineering where it's only 10% women. And so I'm curious to know from your experience and just thinking broadly, what do you think should be done to increase the amount of women who are doing sound engineering and make this issue at least a little bit better?
Well, I would have to say that it's already better. I just gave the keynote, not the keynote, the commencement address at SAE's Nashville campus. And I was really pleased that there was such a high percentage of women that were graduating, many of which wanted to be uh, producers and engineers. So I mean, I think we're still, of course, pretty far from parity, but it has certainly gotten a lot better over the years. And I also think that there's a consciousness that has existed now over the last 20 years or so about purposely trying to involve more women. If you're creating a panel at a convention and it's all men, well, you know how do you involve more women in the panel, um, or just more diversity? I mean, I know that that's a word that has a bad rap these days by some people, but diversity doesn't happen by itself. I mean, left to your own devices, you're going to go with what's easiest, and as opposed to what might be a little more difficult, or what you might have to think a bit more about. And I've always maintained that the best way to start is really to start in um, middle school and high school, so that girls understand, that there are different options available to them. And, um, whether it's in sports or technology, or, science, um, and if you can start early enough, by the time people get to college, it's kind of too late. Oh,
You've mixed the live Grammy front of house sound and also walked on stage yourself to accept the award multiple times. It's sort of like winning the Grammy in your own kind of workplace. What does that feel like? And what was that experience like the first time you walked on stage to do that?
yeah, well, I should clarify, I don't mix the sound for the Grammys.
Mhm.
There are a couple of us that are sort of Academy audio advisors. So there is somebody that mixes the house sound at Staples, and I consider myself more that I sort of, it's a very tough show because there are lots of different artists. Some people were performing live, and and you don't get that much of an opportunity to, you get 3 shots during rehearsal with an act, and then you get the dress rehearsal and the show. So I'm really providing an extra set of ears for the, uh, mixer, and, I like to think that I just, in the end, spread a little fairy dust on it, and, hopefully when you're in the audience, the whole show sounds like, a record. So in that case, I feel like I'm producing a record in terms of the continuity of all the performances. And then there's somebody who does what I do for the um, music mixers for the broadcast. And then somebody else that does that for the actual broadcast mix that
Mhm.
combines all the music and the announcers and, the talent and all of that. So, um, and then, the times that I've actually won awards, of course, it doesn't happen on the main stage. There's an event that happens called the premiere ceremony that happens before the actual Grammys. And actually, the years that I'm nominated are quite stressful for me because the awards are happening, the premiere ceremony is happening at the same time our dress rehearsal is for the show. So I have had to run back and forth, or find out, an approximate time when the awards I'm nominated for
Mhm.
are going to be given, and then I, rush across the street, hope I
Wow, that's
win, and then
amazing. Mhm. Well, in today's day and age of independent artists, what do you think the Grammys and the NARAS still play in shaping careers and signaling quality of musicians?
well, I think, the Recording Academy has a huge, effect on that. I mean, if you just look at any year where there are, relatively new artists that are performing, on the show and how their record sales increase, I think the show itself has, um, a huge effect and, just, it's really hard to be nominated. And I think just being, nominated can be huge to, someone's, um, career. And, and I also think just being a member of the Recording Academy and being part of a group of people that are working with Congress to make life better for musicians working within their own local chapters in their own communities. Um, Working with people and providing a knowledgeable uh, voting, so you know someone like me, for instance, who's an engineer and producer, and I work in a lot of different particular genres. I can vote with some confidence that I know what a good performance is. I know what a good engineered project is.
Yeah.
And, so, yeah, I think it's, incredibly, relevant.
Yeah. So it's custom on the show to to ask about learning and mentorship, especially, and to bring it back full circle. So, who are the people who most taught you something invaluable, something that shaped you not only in your work as a sound engineer, but maybe also you as a person, and what did you learn from being with those people?
Well, I've been very fortunate that I've had a number of mentors in my career that perhaps all taught me, different things. I mentioned David, Rubinson earlier. Not only did David teach me about producing, he was also a manager. He owned a jukebox company. He owned, music publishing companies. It was very sort of hands in everything having to do with music. So I learned an enormous amount from David, including about wine, because David had a quite a nice wine collection and sort of exposed me um, to that and set me down a path that lasted for years, including making my own wine. But I think probably the person that had the biggest influence on my career was Roy Halley, who was probably best known as Simon and Garfunkel's engineer. And my first job at a recording studio was at ABC Recording Studios in LA. It was part of ABC Records, and Roy
Yeah.
was hired as the head of A&R. And he taught me so many techniques and things like that that I still use to this day. And I was very happy that in the Paul Simon documentary that came out in 2023, I just watched it recently, that Roy's featured quite a bit, and that Paul pays uh, the appropriate tribute to Roy in terms of the sound, the way he crafted the sound that actually made those records sound the way they 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 did.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Leslie. It's been an
You're welcome.
absolute honor, and just speaking to you, you're so wise about the world of music, and especially about what you do as a sound engineer. So we're very honored to have you with us on the show here today.
Well, thanks, Fawn, and I hope we get a chance to work together again.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.